Hi, I'm Chuck Mintz. I'm a photographer from Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm here today to talk about my work in Lustron Stories, which is currently on exhibit in Studio M at the Massillon Museum. I was born in Cleveland, and I live in Cleveland now. I've pretty much spent on and off my entire life in the city. I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Purdue and a master's from Cleveland State. I've studied photography in community college, at Parsons School of Design, and other places. In 1979, I had always been a camera bug, and I decided to spend a week at Maine Photographic Workshop studying with a Canadian landscape photographer I literally had never heard of, Freeman Patterson. And lucky for me, Freeman turned out to be a great teacher, an inspiring teacher. And really at that time, I decided that someday I was going to do photography full time. A year later, we moved to New Jersey, and this photograph is in Yonkers, New York, on a workshop with the photographer Eva Rubinstein. And for the longest time, because of the commitment I made back then, I would photograph pretty religiously 4 or 5 hours a week, always finding time and making time to do it. I got rid of all my hobbies, tried to, and I would make photographs like this one, kind of what I always called the anonymous landscape. People were in the pictures, but they were generally unrecognizable. So I wake up in the morning on January 1st, 2008, I guess, and now I'm a full-time photographer, and I go, okay, what am I going to do? And I started to conceptualize one of my first projects, the album project, which was an exhibit of my son who has autism, and the album's full of Polaroid photographs he's made since the time back then, when he was 15 years old. He needed scoliosis surgery. So we bought him this camera so he would kind of have a way to understand what was going to happen. And he took to this camera and made these carefully annotated Polaroids, and has filled these albums pretty much for the time between the surgery and the actual exhibit, which was about a year after I started doing these things full time. This is at the Butler Institute in Youngstown, and you can see that Polaroids are nearly full size because I wanted people to be able to actually appreciate these as Polaroids, which are very special things. My projects over time developed kind of a formula. They start with some idea or concept. In the album project, they were, how am I going to capture this young man in this work that he's done? They have some sort of graphical identity I set out with. So in that case, these were large format film photographs. I wanted things to be big. I wanted you to be able to read the Polaroids as Polaroids. And I kind of just go to work. In Lustron Stories, the project that we have on exhibit here, this was about these homes that were built between 1948 and 1950 that were this sort of crazy post-war response to things. And I wanted people to, I wanted to kind of know who was living in these homes, really. It wasn't about the architecture. It was really about how do people interact with their homes. But I had no idea what it was going to mean. So I just went to work. And these projects all sort of follow that dynamic. The next thing I worked on was a project called Every Place I've Ever Lived, the foreclosure project in 12 neighborhoods. My childhood home, which was actually in the background of that first image of me you saw, looking so adorable, dressed up much nicer than I ever dress now, And it had been foreclosed, and it made me curious about what was going on during the foreclosure crisis. This was in 2008, 2007, 2009, when it was very, very fresh, although regrettably it's still here with us today. So I made these images in these neighborhoods, most are in the Cleveland area, but around the country, and I printed them on fabric. And I made 2 images of each one of these homes. One that I screwed to a 4x4 sheet of cheap plywood, and the other that I made into a window shade that pulled down over the first one. The next project I undertook was a project that I did in collaboration with Cleveland Public Theater in Cleveland, and this was of actors in their homes and on stage. And I wanted to sort of explore the idea of kind of when we're acting and when we're presenting ourselves, and the trouble we always have, and it's a problem in photography, determining kind of what's real. So public theater, you can see the center image of Carly, and then she was actually living at her parents' home. Carly is not necessarily one to go out and shoot deer, but this is the kind of little rumpus room on the back of her dad's and mom's house. The next major project I undertook was a project called Precious Objects. And in this project, I photographed people with something they've had a long time that has special meaning that they would not replace if they lost. And then I had them write about these things, and so I began photographing people. Again, this was large film camera, 8x10 films, in studio or in some locations. I photographed in 2 locations on Long Island, Columbus, Houston, Los Angeles, Atlanta, a number of places. And then I would have people write about this experience. And then at first, I was sort of interested in comparing these objects with commercial things. So I would sneak into department stores and photograph things. And pretty much I figured out that nobody much cared about my opinions on consumer culture, but these stories became very, very, very personal. In this photograph, Roxanne has the dress that she was adopted in. And this is the second book I published. This is Loli, who has letters from her mother. Her mother died in Loli's childbirth. And the other thing that happened to these people who were either strangers or near strangers often would become friends after I photographed them, which has been true in all of the projects I've done. And then you learn more about these stories, and then you find out that Loli's mother was a Holocaust survivor, had moved to Israel, gotten married, pregnant, and then died in childbirth. And these are stories, sort of like you can't make this stuff up. These are so compelling that it's more important than my, commentary on why it's shallow to have 72 kinds of perfume at Macy's, This is Trevis, who showed up, had never met the man, didn't know who I was, I didn't know who he was, with his inmate card from prison and his library card to show how far he'd come. And another story, well beyond my ability to make something up or create something, it's just the story. And this, now this is actually after Lustron Stories, but this is a project that I did on hardware stores. And with this project, I was back to the big camera again, so I was schlepping this monster to hardware stores around the country. And I really had this idea that hardware stores represented something that was important that we were losing track of. They were a vision of retailing, they are a vision of retailing, because the ones left are clearly survivors, that's very different than a big box store or Amazon. And so I would go in these hardware stores and while I was photographing, and these were very long exposures, they were like 6-minute exposures, life would happen. People would come in and forget their money, and they'd go up to the counter, and the guy at the counter said, "Don't worry, I'll hold on to it. You know, you go home and get it." One of the stores I was in, a guy comes in and says, "I need a needle to fill up some soccer balls." This was in California. And the guy goes, he digs through all this stuff, and he says 69 cents, and the customer goes, "You don't happen to have a pump I can borrow?" And so, "Oh yeah, sure." And he gives him the pump, and he leaves. And by the time I was done with the photograph, this guy had returned the pump. And these don't happen at Home Depot. They just don't. Now, what does it all mean? I don't know. I mean, it really is something that I learn as I look at this work over time. A project that I was working on when this virus kind of changed how things work was a project on librarians with favorite books in Carnegie libraries. And the Andrew Carnegie story is kind of a story that completely intrigues me. He was as ruthless a businessman as you almost could imagine. He had people killed. And yet Carnegie believed he was a working man, which is curious. And he believed that he had an obligation both to make as much money as he could and to help as much as he could. And he actually believed that rich people should not leave inheritances. And so he started funding public libraries, and his only requirement was that the town tax to support the library. It couldn't all be philanthropic. That was literally his only requirement. And these things, this is in Goldendale, Washington, which I think has 1,800 people in it. And it amazed me as I got around the country that you would go into libraries in Cleveland or Cincinnati or these tiny little towns, under 2,000, and there'd be public libraries. And these libraries, and again, I didn't know what it meant, right? I just was photographing, have been up until this year. And the meaning of this is sort of compelling, which is we sometimes think of libraries as obsolete or no longer interesting, and yet they tend to be very, very busy, particularly in cities. And they're public spaces. They're one of the few really public spaces in our culture anymore. Museums have sort of evolved over years to become more public. The Cleveland Museum of Art, for example, has always, or for the longest time, had free admission. But even as a public space, it was really a public space for a certain part of the population. And libraries, on the contrary, have, since they become public libraries, which was kind of a new idea in Carnegie's time, have served as real public space. And this brings us to Lustron Stories. And these people living in these more or less identical homes around the country. Lustron manufactured about 2,500 of these in Columbus between 1948 and 50. I had been working with the Ohio History Center. I exhibited the Every Place project there. I also photographed for Precious Objects there. And they were going to do a 5-year program in the 50s. And one of the curators there handed me their journal at the time, which had this article about Lustron Corporation. And I read this thing, and I said, and I kind of got intrigued with it, partly because I was born in 1948. So this is American culture through my lifetime. Referring back to that first picture of me in the very duded up outfit, The house behind it was the house I grew up in, which was not a steel house, but it was in every other way identical. It's small, 2-bedroom, 1,100 square feet, bungalow, starter home built in 1949. It was a Lustron other than it was actually made like most homes are made. And these things are pretty much everywhere in the eastern US. Lustron had an advantage over Levittown, which was another response at the time, that they could put up one house. The house in this first image is actually in Massillon. It's not part of the project. It's one of the 600 or 700 letters I wrote asking for people to participate. That was not fun. And I've got perhaps 10%, 15% response to those letters, partly because even the prestigious internet doesn't always give you the right place, and there were a couple of databases that showed these things online. They weren't always perfect. And frankly, people, even a few years ago, had already stopped reading their mail. And so I actually got a response like a month after I sent the letter from someone and said, yeah, I just looked at it, I'd be interested in doing it. And I said, well, I was in Kansas City 3 weeks ago, and it's like, okay. This one's in Massillon. It's north of Lincoln here and a bit east of the museum. There are 2 in Canton that were in the project. This is an original owner in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and his wife, Bob and Minerva. Bob was a 1950s kind of handyman. So he had substantially modified this house. He had called Lustron when he built the house and worked with them to put a basement under it. These houses were built on a slab. Part of the idea was that a local contractor could assemble a house in 350 man hours. But Bob wanted a basement. And since then, he's sided it and enclosed it and added things. He actually had a room that he added on in his basement that had been a fallout shelter in the 50s. And delightful people. One of the things I've learned with my projects that involve volunteers is getting volunteers has to be one of the least favored things I do. I mean, it's right there around going to the dentist. You're kind of in there. The difference is that when people volunteer, they're incredibly generous and gracious. And Bob certainly among them. Bob actually gave me, if I can fish out of all of this stuff I've piled up. There it is. He reached up into the kind of wall in his basement and gave me this barometer. And it's like, Bob, I'm here working on a project, I appreciate your help. He said, no, I want you to have this. And it's beautiful. Robert, Madison, Indiana. The first time, one of the things I do is I'll enter my work in juried exhibitions around the country. And then if I get in, I'll go to the opening and try to get the gallery interested in my work. I actually was in a juried exhibition in Louisville at Public Gallery there, which ultimately showed this whole project. This was before that. And I work on my projects when I'm going to these things. So I'll go to the opening and then I'll set up appointments. This is in Madison, Indiana, which is on the Ohio River between Louisville and Cincinnati. And Bob apologized to me because he had to shingle the roof. These Lustron houses were porcelain enamel steel, and everything was made out of it. These exterior panels you see, the roofs, the interior panels were made out of glass-covered steel. It was a material that was really commonly used for bathroom fixtures. So bathtubs and sinks and stuff were made out of it. And if you had one of these in your home when you were a kid, they always had some chips out of them somewhere. And so you see the black primer underneath. And if you're careful looking at the exhibit here at Studio M, you'll see that some of them have those same artifacts on them. And when the curator did the damage report, she pointed out and I said, no, they're there sort of on purpose, you know, but it's okay, it's a museum. This is Richard in Kansas City. Richard was a retired Boilermaker with the Santa Fe Railroad. And Richard was a collector. And Richard wanted to show me inside, but he didn't want me photographing inside because he had these collections. He had aluminum cake pans, you know, like shaped in baseball mitts so you could make it. He had a set of VHS tapes. He said, you know, you can't get those anymore. And Richard insisted on giving me this Thomas Kincaid plate. And it's like, again, Richard, you know, this has been delightful. And he said, no, I want you to have it. So I said, Richard, is it okay if I make the photographs with you holding the plate, which is what we did. A couple who wrote me this heartbreaking letter about how he had lost his job and how he now was working in some low-paid thing, and they were okay, but barely getting by. And it's a real artifact of the economy here in the last 15 years. And people would write me letters. This is from Mrs. Beam in Defiance. And Mrs. Beam was at the time in a nursing home. And another thing I noticed with these Lustron houses is friends would look out for people. And in fact, a number of them were purchased by friends for them. In this case, Mr. Cayley here was a friend of Mrs. Beam, and so he met me at the house and did the photographs. And more than once I had an owner that was, original owner in this case, living in assisted living or nursing home that couldn't be there. And some friend said, I'm taking care of the house, we'll show it to you. It was raining like hell that day. And he was a little bit late. And I'm out there in the rain with this wooden camera, and it's like, but it turned out to be a pretty sweet picture. This is another example of the owner. This is in Topeka, of the owner being in a nursing home. And this woman was a bar owner that had befriended the widower that owned the home. And when he went into assisted living, she said, well, I'll take care of your house for you. And you think about the levels of generosity that not only are these people taking care of their neighbors, but their neighbor gets the person gets a letter from me, this complete stranger from Cleveland, Ohio, and says, oh, I'll help you do that. This is in suburban Illinois. He was kind of a character. He said, you know, you don't need a saw and a hammer and nails to fix these things. You need a Sawzall and some zip screws, you know. And it's like, although I'm not sure what you do because it's glass on steel. So it's like impossible to put holes in and stuff. It's kind of a difficult material. This is Fort Wayne. This is in here for all the old 50s hi-fi bugs. Those are magnaplanar speakers behind them. And you can see, this is, again, 1,100 square foot bungalow. Those are big speakers. And you can see they're like 60, 70 inches tall. But he was all set up, and behind him is the screen for his projection TV. He was like, and they had about 87 cats. So it was an interesting place. This is outside of Philadelphia in New Jersey. This is Carl and Carl. And they've remained friends. Disabled young woman living in this as a community facility with her mom. This is in Bristol, Virginia, Bristol is the birthplace of country music. At least Bristol thinks they're the birthplace of country music. This is Defiance. He got mad at me because he had a sign out front that he was like a jack of all trades, and it said he was a carpenter. And so when I put things together, I called him a carpenter. He said, no, I'm not a carpenter, I'm a roofer. And it's like, okay. This is being used as a B&B on the Mississippi River on the Wisconsin side, near Minneapolis. Columbus, Ohio. A lot of them in Ohio. You know, I've talked a lot about the generosity of people. But before I do that, I do want to talk a little bit about the presentation here, which is not in this slideshow, but please come visit. The frames are made out of the same stuff that the houses were made out of. And which, sometimes I think it's cooler than the pictures. And I found a company in Knoxville, Tennessee that fabricates this material. It's pretty much an obsolete material today. And the guy that was running it knew about Lustron. And so, somebody, a business, a manufacturing business, they're not looking for some artist making 25 frames. That all need to be custom designed and made. But these guys really did a great job. And if you come to the museum, which I highly recommend, you can see their handiwork and why it makes me so happy. There also is a book for this guy too, which is available in the gift store here. And so a little bit of advertising for the MassMu Museum. This was published by Trillium Books, which is an imprint of the Ohio State University Press. And if you buy the book from the museum here, you help the museum, you help the press, and I get 18 cents, so it's all good. But I want to really thank the Ohio History Connection and all the people that have been involved in supporting this project, and particularly everyone who participated.